Under the lantern's glow, the little rail station seemed suspended in a hush, the wide plains stretching into an endless darkness beyond. Elias Boone stood there with his hat in his hands, his boots planted on weathered planks that creaked when he shifted his weight. Steam hissed from the iron engine and drifted into the night air, a ghostly veil that made the faces of strangers blur as they stepped down from the cars. He searched for her with a heart that beat like a hammer against his ribs. This was meant to be a turning, a wife to ease the loneliness, a mother for the boy who clung to his sleeve, a chance to make his ranch less hollow. She came in lace gloves and a sky-blue dress that seemed too fine for dust. Clara Whitfield, 19, her chin lifted as though she had arrived in a place beneath her notice. Her eyes swept him once, and whatever measure she took in that glance, his broad shoulders, the girth he carried from long winters of salted pork, the plain cut of his coat, froze her smile into something brittle. He held out his hand, thick from work, callous from rope and plow. "Miss Whitfield," he said softly. Her lips barely moved. "Mr. Boone." Silas tugged his uncle's arm, whispering, "She's pretty." Elias tried to agree with a nod, but his throat burned. For Clara's gaze had slipped past him already, toward the town beyond, and her face spoke not of welcome, but of distaste. It was later, away from the station's noise, when she spoke the words that struck deeper than a bullet. She leaned close, her perfume sharp with roses, and murmured, "I will not what a man shaped by gluttony and dust." The words cut clean. Elias said nothing. He only tipped his hat, as if to excuse himself from his own disgrace. Around them, curious ears caught enough to carry the story like wildfire. By the time night settled, tongues wagged from saloon to churchyard. The fat rancher spurned at the altar. Elias walked home, with Silas beneath a sky heavy with stars that seemed cruel in their brightness. The boy asked why the lady would not ride back with them. Elias pressed a hand on his nephew's shoulder and said only she'd change her mind. But in town, Clara lingered, housed at Miss Hattie Lovelorn's boarding house, where gossip was ladled out with morning porridge. Miss Hattie retold the tale, until even those who hadn't been at the station swore they had seen the moment she refused him. "The Whitfield girl's got sense," she clucked. "No need to tether herself to a man too big for his saddle." Clara thrived in the attention, preening in borrowed lace, waiting for a suitor of finer cut. In the quiet shadow she cast, her younger sister Maybelle remained. 17, softer in voice, plainer in dress, she had traveled with Clara more as chaperone than participant. In the corners of parlors, she listened more than she spoke, her eyes following Elias when he passed through town with a nod of courtesy, his shame carried like a burden strapped across his back. One evening, Clara laughed cruelly at supper, telling Maybelle, "Better he find a horse to marry than me." Elias had entered the boarding house to return a forgotten parcel. He heard the words, offered only a polite tip of his hat, and turned away before the sting showed in his eyes. Maybelle's heart clenched. She saw something in his silence, a dignity not broken by humiliation, but weathered like wood worn smooth by storms. That night, while Clara prattled of her prospects, Maybelle stood at the window and whispered to the dark, "He does not deserve to be mocked." The decision came upon her quietly, as if it had been waiting all along. Grace sometimes moves not with trumpets, but in the simple step of one girl crossing a threshold. Maybelle approached Elias at the livery the next day, her hands knotted in her shawl. "Mr. Boone," she said, voice small but steady, "my sister has made her choice. But I will stand in her place if you'll have me." Elias stared, unsure whether pity or jest moved her. Yet her gaze did not waver, and Silas, peeking from behind the stall, whispered, "She's kind, uncle." And so it was agreed without flourish or kiss, only a nod. An understanding passed like the quiet exchange of rains. Life on the Boone Ranch unfolded in measured rhythm. Dawn found Elias in the fields, sweat darkening his shirt as he turned soil. Maybelle rose early, coaxing fire from ash, mending shirts with neat stitches, humming tunes that softened silence. Silas followed her like a shadow, content in her gentle attention. Meals were modest: beans, bread, salted meat, And yet when Maybelle passed the bread toward Elias, her fingers brushed his, leaving a spark he did not name. At night, the fire crackled while she sat mending, her hair loose around her shoulders, and though Elias longed to speak, he found words heavy in his chest. Shame still clung, whispers from neighbors calling her the spare sister, laughter carried on the wind from Sunday gatherings. Still, something tender grew in small gestures. When Elias left his coat on her chair, when she placed an extra spoonful of stew on his plate, when Silas nestled between them by the hearth and sighed with contentment. These were seeds taking root in silence. But silence, too, bore scars. One night, Silas stirred from his pallet, hearing soft voices. Clara had come to visit, her sharp tongue cutting Maybelle for her choice. He heard his aunt's breath catch, then the faintest murmur, as though to herself, but loud enough for the boy to catch. We pretend to be asleep so they don't hit us. Silas lay stiff, not understanding, only knowing it sounded wrong, heavy. In the morning, he asked his uncle what she meant. Elias's chest tightened. That night, after chores were done, he found Maybelle by the fire, sewing by lamplight. Silas said you spoke words in the night, Elias said carefully. Her hands paused, needle trembling. She did not look up. It was nothing. I would hear from you, he pressed gently. At last her eyes lifted, shining with unshed tears. When father came home with whiskey, we learned to feign sleep. It spared us his hand. Clara forgot. I never did. The confession lingered in the still air. Elias's breath caught. He had thought her meek, unscarred. But here was strength forged not in laughter, but in endurance. He reached for words and found only silence. Yet his hand, rough and scarred, settled over hers. She did not pull away. For the first time since the station, Elias felt the weight of shame loosen, replaced by awe. Outside, the wind swept across the plains, rattling the shutters. Inside, the fire burned low, shadows bending close, as though the house itself leaned to listen. And in that hush, Elias Boone understood. This girl beside him was not the leftover sister. She was the one who had learned to survive the dark. The lamp flickered, her eyes still on him, waiting. The night seemed to hold its breath, as though asking what he would do next. The weeks after her confession seemed to ripple with a new, unspoken awareness. Elias watched Maybelle in small, stolen glances. The way her fingers soothed Silas's hair when he woke from nightmares, the way she lingered a moment longer at the door to be sure the latch was set, the way her humming softened the house like a balm. She carried herself with a quiet grace, but beneath it Elias saw something sturdier, like the trunk of a tree scarred by storms yet still standing tall. For years he had believed shame could hollow a man until nothing remained, but in her presence he began to sense that wounds, if carried with dignity, might yet become a kind of strength. He did not speak of it. He only found himself slowing when she walked beside him to the barn, or listening longer when her voice lifted in song while she hung linens in the wind. A bond was forming, though no words declared it. It was there in the way he set aside the best portion of meat for her plate, and in the way she mended his coat as though it mattered. Their shadows, thrown across the cabin wall by the firelight, never quite touched, yet they leaned toward each other as if drawn by some unseen force. But the town had long memory for shame. Sheriff Amos Cutter, with his keen eye for others' weakness, took to telling the story again over poker games. Boone's so desperate he bought himself the spare sister. He'd chuckle, and the men laughed, their voices carrying. By the next Sunday, the whispers had settled into the church pews. Maybelle felt them on her skin, the weight of stairs pressing between her shoulder blades as though she were a thief caught in the act. She bowed her head, but her cheeks flushed crimson. Elias heard it too, the murmurs a second choice, and poor fat Boone. Old shame curled in him like smoke. He thought of leaving the church, sparing her the sting, but Maybelle surprised him. She lifted her chin, not high like Clara in pride, but steady, her hand finding Silas's small fingers and holding them firm. She walked straight through the crowd of eyes, her back unbent. Elias followed, his own heart pounding with both pain and admiration. Later, when the boy slept, he whispered into the night, "Courage isn't the absence of shame. It's her." The days passed, but gossip is a wildfire hard to smother. Clara returned one afternoon, stepping from a buggy with cheeks flushed and eyes bright, wearing a gown finer than before. She carried herself as though regret had softened her pride. "Elias," she said in the general store, loud enough for all to hear, "I was foolish. If you'll have me, I will reclaim what should have been mine." The words fell heavy. Elias's throat closed around any answer. He looked at Maybelle, who stood at the counter with a parcel of flour in her hands. Her eyes lowered instantly, not in submission but in defense, as though the ground had been stripped from under her feet. Clara smirked, turning to the crowd. "It is clear my sister was only ever stand-in. We all know it." The townsfolk chuckled, half believing, half cruel. Elias opened his mouth, but no sound came. Silence was his oldest habit, and it cut deeper than any word. Maybelle felled it like a blade and said nothing, only finished her purchase and walked past him into the sunlit street, her steps brisk, her shoulders rigid with hurt. That night, Elias found her packing. Her shawl, her hymnal, the small comb she carried. She placed them in a cloth bundle with hands that trembled but did not stop. Silas clung to her skirts, tears glistening. "Don't go," he pleaded. "You make the house light." Elias stood in the doorway, every nerve straining, yet he could not form the words to keep her. He feared he was too broken, too scarred by ridicule to offer her a life. But when he saw Silas's arms wrapped around her waist, he understood that her presence was not only comfort but salvation. She was the warmth that held the boy steady, the anchor that turned their bare rooms into a home. Still, she left her bundle by the door, waiting for morning. The next day, the market was crowded, voices loud as Clara's words cut through them like a knife. "He deserves better than a cast-off sister," she sneered, standing before Maybelle with eyes glittering. She was never chosen. She was taken. The crowd turned, eager for spectacle. Maybelle's face burned, her throat tight with unshed tears. Elias stood at the edge, his hat low, his shame a familiar weight pressing him into silence. But then Silas's voice rang out, clear and unflinching. "She chose us. She chose me." The boy's declaration broke something open in Elias. The hush that followed seemed endless, the whole town watching, waiting. And at last Elias stepped forward. His voice carried, low but steady, a man laying down a burden. It was never pity. It was grace. And it was Maybelle who carried this house from silence to song. The words stunned the crowd. Gossip, so quick to ignite, found no fuel against such raw truth. Clara's lips parted, then closed in fury. She turned on her heel, skirts whipping, and stormed away. Her rejection returned to her at last. Maybelle stood frozen, her bundle still waiting at the door in her mind. Elias moved to her side, not touching yet, only close enough that his nearness felt like a promise. The townsfolk looked on, some shamed into silence, others softened by the sight. For the first time, Elias met their eyes without lowering his own, as though he had found in Maybelle's courage a reflection of his own worth. They returned to the ranch under a sky painted with streaks of dying light. Inside, Maybelle stood by the lamplight, her bundle set down, her face uncertain. Elias removed his coat and laid it across her shoulders, then reached to draw Silas against them both. No words followed, only the warmth of three figures drawn into the same circle of light. Outside, the plain stretched vast and unending, but within those walls was shelter, a fragile but fierce bond born not of choosing first or second, but of choosing truly. The fire snapped, shadows leaned close, and the silence was no longer heavy but full, as though holding its breath for what might yet come. And in that hush, Maybelle's eyes lifted to Elias's, searching, waiting. He held her gaze, the boy between them, the coat binding them together. For the first time, he let himself believe the story was not about rejection at all, but about survival, about love growing in the quiet where no one thought to look. The lamp guttered, flame bowing low, and the night seemed poised for an answer neither dared yet to speak.